Welcome everyone to this first session of the SfNC meeting, and thank you all for being here. I am Emmanuel Vol. I am a member of the SfNC Executive Committee, and I am delighted to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Professor Todd Lubart. Todd Lubart is a professor of psychology at the University Paris-Cité in the Applied Psychology and Ergonomics Lab. Over the past 30 years, he has authored or co-authored books, articles, and chapters about creativity. He made the incredible number of about 200 contributions. Quantity, but also quality. I can testify that his book, entitled Psychology of Creativity, introduced many researchers, including myself, to the field of creativity research. Also, Todd contributed to developing measures of creative potential in children and adults, for instance, with the Epoch Battery. Todd has been awarded for his work on creativity, including awards from the American Psychological Association, World Council of Gifted and Talented, and International Center for Innovation in Education. He ran a research lab focused on individual differences and has been responsible for several large-scale research grants, fostering research on creativity assessment, creative development, creative process, and creative environment. He is currently director of a university chair entitled Homo Creativus at the Fondation Université Paris-Cité. He is also president of the International Society for the Study of Creativity and Innovation, ISSCI. So in one word, Todd can be seen as an efficient and central node, a hub in the creativity research network. So I am glad and honored to have Todd Lubart today, giving a presentation entitled Homo Creativus, the 7 C's of Creativity. So just one thing before we begin, please ask your questions during the session by typing them in the Ask a Question tab or in the chat with a question mark. And you can also vote for the questions of others. Thank you, Todd. Please come on screen and navigate us on the 7 C's of creativity.
Okay. Am I here with you now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you to everybody for being here, and thanks for this invitation to present at your conference. I'm going to give you an overview of various topics on creativity, which I hope can link in with the different kinds of work and research that each of you are involved in. So thank you, Emmanuel, for that introduction. Now, obviously, we know that creativity is often referred to these days as a 21st century competency, one of the 4 C's, 4 main competencies of the 21st century movement, which includes creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. However, this capacity to be creative has actually been with us in our, let's say, genetic endowment since the very beginning. Because if you go back more than 2 million years ago, you find our ancestor, Homo habilis, who was inventing tools for hunting. Notably, at one moment, the idea came to take rocks that were naturally lying around and to change their form, to make them hunting tools. And so we have traces of this in archaeology. We might consider that to be the first traces of human-like creative thinking. And as we go fast forward over the years, we see all kinds of creative activities leading to the culture and the way of life we have today. So we had, for example, the creation of clothing, the creation of agricultural techniques, the creation of making shelters, creation of cultural habits and ceremonies, and all kinds of culinary creation, etc. So if you look at the caves of Lascaux, for example, cave art around 40,000 years ago, we might consider that to be some of the first artistic creative work that remains today. When we look at international work these days, in the recent times, you see the World Economic Forum indicating creativity is one of the top 3 capacities for employability in the next 20 years. PISA integrating creative thinking as a special skill in the current round, and OECD doing studies on whether we can boost creativity in school children and in university level students. So all this is just some background to say that the topic that we're all interested in has been with us from the very beginning. Now, I'm sure you all have the basic definition of creativity, which I just put here for a reminder, that we tend to see creativity as an ability. It's an ability to generate new ideas, new productions. These productions are original, at least for the person generating them, and maybe for the larger social system in which that person is located. So it may be local social system or a more global social system, like the community of practitioners in their domain of work. And these new original productions are meaningful. They make sense. They're not just strange ideas. Now, of course, you can be creative in all kinds of domains. Here's a few examples, like scientific, culinary, artistic, engineering, commercial, advertising, literary, and so forth. We could consider that some domains professionally are very focused on creativity, like design, artists, writers, and others involve creativity now and then in the job, but they're not 100% focused on it. Maybe lawyers, teachers, for example, managers. And then others are occasionally calling on creativity in special circumstances. For example, airline pilots are not very creative. They're not supposed to be too creative in their job, but maybe occasionally it can be very important for them to create, implement new ideas to solve problems that the plane is having. Now, I'd like to introduce to you the idea of the 7 C's. I'm sure you've heard of the 4 P's: creative person, process, place, and product. And perhaps you've heard of Vlad Glavinow's 5 A's. But the 7 C's was something that I had come to mind for a special issue of Journal of Creative Behavior, which was celebrating the 50 years of a very important article by Guilford. And in fact, the Journal of Creative Behavior is the longest running journal. And so at that occasion, I looked at all the articles in that journal from the beginning, when it started in 1967, and that formed a certain corpus of articles. And I categorized them in my own way into different piles of topics. And it ended up that there were 7 piles. Each pile I called by a word C, because we're on creativity, and that formed the 7 C's. In fact, so it's not a theory, it's just a system that might help to think about the field. It's just descriptive. And if you know the concept of the 7 C's, you may know that it refers to the 7 oceans or the 7 bodies of water around the world, which reflect the 7 heavens in the mythological meaning of the 7 C's. So to say you traveled the 7 C's means you covered the whole topic. You traveled the whole world, in fact. So what are these C's? Well, the first one is creator. What are the characteristics of creative people? For example, what kind of cognitive capacities do they have? What kind of personality do they have? Creating refers to the process of producing this new original work. How does this process unfold as someone engages in a task? Collaboration refers to studies, research about how people interact, perhaps in teams, in groups, perhaps in dyads, perhaps between a creator and their close colleagues who reflect on their work and give them feedback. And so this is the collaborative aspect of creativity. Of course, in groups, it's a group creativity collaboration. Context is the environment that might support or hinder creative work and how that impacts the work. Creation is the productions. And then we have consumption, which is the uptake of creative ideas. This is the idea of adopting these new ideas and how the public receives them, and the whole process of meeting with the creative production. Because in fact, in my opinion, creativity is not just a person or small group producing some idea and that's the end of it. There is the meeting point where the social world meets the creation. And finally, curricula refers to the idea that we could train creativity, and all the research about how to train creativity falls under this C of curricula in terms of development of creative capacity. So I'm going to briefly look at some work that we have done with colleagues in our research lab in Paris. We have several colleagues in our lab, and we work on many things as a team effort over the years. And so I just want to cite some examples of each C. Of course, I'm just drawing on some personal work, but I'm sure all of you could perhaps see how your work can fit into these different rubrics, each of the C's. And some of the work, of course, can be combining two or more C's in it. So when we talk about creators, one thing of interest is to model individual differences. What is underlying the creative potential of people? What leads some people to have more creative potential than others? And then, of course, people can take this creative potential and transform it into a creative production by activating the process. So in early work, we took what is called the multivariate approach to creative potential, saying that there are some cognitive abilities that are important, for example, mental flexibility. There are some cognitive personality type traits that would be supportive of creative thinking, like openness. There are some emotional, affect-related traits or states that could benefit creative potential. And there is the environment with both local and more macro environmental factors that is supporting, stimulating, or inhibiting creative potential. And so you can think of it as ingredients in a recipe. To make a cake, you have more or less of the different ingredients. This gives you a profile of potential to do a certain kind of task. And as you can think about cakes, a certain ingredients put you in a good position to make one kind of cake and not such a good position to make another kind of cake. This leads us to the idea that there's individual differences related to domain and task specificity based on the ingredients that you have. When you turn on these ingredients, you put them into play in the creative process, you end up with a production that we could evaluate as more or less original, adaptive, and so forth. Now, here's a couple example case studies. of the multivariate approach to creators. So first we could talk about Vincent van Gogh, because he is a well-known creative person. He left a lot of evidence about his creative thinking, about his life, in all of his letters to his brother Theo and so forth. And you see a self-portrait of Van Gogh that was a recent self-portrait for the COVID period, as you can see. And he was particularly bothered by the fact that he was missing an ear, you can imagine. So you see a painting that he did. Now, what you might know is that in his life, he was not super creative his whole life long. He was creative at a certain moment of his life, a certain period. It was the period in Arles where he had all these ingredients come together. So he had knowledge he had acquired of other painters. For example, you see a painting in the middle of the screen by Jean-Francois Millet, who Van Gogh was a big fan of Millet. And he was such a fan that he was inspired seriously by the content of many Millet paintings, as you can see here. Also, at the time he was in Arles, he had good support from his brother to live, and he had the visit of Gauguin, who is shown in a self-portrait of Gauguin, which was a socially stimulating context for Van Gogh. So you can analyze cases and see how all the ingredients work together in some of these great cases. We think the same ingredients are involved in more everyday cases, just that the convergence of the multiple ingredients is less special or perfect in these more everyday cases. Another case that we had a chance to interview Martin Cooper, who is shown here with the first working cell phone. He's considered the inventor of the cell phone, of course, with a big team of engineers that he directed. He was able to reveal some of the different ingredients that were present that helped him invent this concept of the cell phone. And one of them was that he was working on walkie-talkie systems before he had the cell phone idea. So he was an expert in walkie-talkie systems. When he deployed them, he noticed how some users reacted in strange ways, saying that it wasn't optimal, the walkie-talkie system. It didn't have all the features they wanted. And so he was in particular in a mode of user interfacing, which made them have special knowledge. Also, he worked at Motorola, which was a company at the time that was a very stimulating environment for innovation and very much supported Martin Cooper when he came with this idea of a kind of super walkie-talkie system, which is our cell phone system. Okay, a few words about how to detect this creative potential in children and adults. First, in adults, we tend to measure the different ingredients, measure personality, measure mental flexibility, etc. And we try to get a profile for an individual and compare it to a profile for a task. Here's an example of one of our measures of an ingredient. The ingredient is mental flexibility. And we start out by showing this picture of a building. This is an example in which the person says to us what they see, and they say they see a building. And then the building changes little by little, picture by picture as they see it. And they tell us what they see every time. Some people keep seeing the building a long time. Others, more or less quickly, see that it is no longer a building, and eventually everybody sees it's a penguin. And so the rapidity with which people let go of their initial idea is for us an index of mental flexibility. It's one of the ingredients. It goes in the profile, and we measure many. And this way we model creative potential. In children, we developed over the years the evaluation of potential creativity epoch battery. And we have different tasks for the artistic, graphic, verbal, literary, social, math, science domains. and we're working on music also and kinesthetic movement. This is available and being developed in various languages. And it was used in OECD in a certain study in 10 countries as a pre-test, post-test, as OECD wanted to see if teachers can really boost the creative thinking of their students. And so this battery served pre-test, post-test in that study. Now, in the battery, there's two kinds of tasks. There's what we call divergent exploratory thinking, in which we obviously give a stimulus and ask children to think of many ideas. And this is an example from the artistic domain in which we gave a banana form. And children, this one child here gave 10 ideas. So is 10 ideas good? Well, in France, for a child of 9 years old, to give 10 ideas is normal. So this child would get a score that they are typical for their age. Of course, in each country, we need to have norms for this kind of task. In the other kind of task we use is convergent integrative, in which we give the children, again, in a domain like the graphic domain, a set of elements. We ask them to make one big drawing. Here you see a drawing by two different kids. The first drawing on the left is a child who just took the objects we gave and put them together in a little bedroom scene. Some of the objects are not really too integrated. There's a bed, there's a little fish toy on the bed. There's a light bulb that's blue. Our light bulb is blue. There's a person, a wood mannequin, and there's like their school bag and hat, and there's a carrot hanging around. There's a prototypical idea to make a bedroom scene, and things are not too well put together. So this would get a relatively low score because it's kind of typical and not well integrated. You see on the right another kid who did a fishing scene, which is pretty common with these objects, and they're more integrated. It's not a very original idea, but it does show some synthesis, and that is the creative convergence aspect. They get a better score. And here you see drawings by two other children, which shows greater synthesis and more originality. So they'll get a higher score yet. The rabbit with light bulbs as feet and the valise as a body, carrots as ears, is a pretty interesting proposition. And the one on the right, the child called it the samurai warrior. The fish became the head of the warrior. The light bulb became the body of the warrior. And the sword of the warrior is composed of a carrot with the wood mannequin. So this was a quite unusual and well-integrated concept. So we can situate a kid compared to others from their local population. And we chose to use an IQ-like system where 100 is normal and 15 points is a standard deviation. So in this kind of system, if a child has, for example, 130, there are two standard deviations above the norm on divergent graphic and integrative graphic, we would call them high potential creative graphic. And studies that we did were able to show that the structure of the battery corresponds to our theoretical concept. And this battery was used in one study, both in France and in Hong Kong. In that study, we had Chinese kids in Hong Kong, French kids in France, and Hong Kong Chinese kids who were in France, and French kids who lived in Hong Kong. And so we were able to study if the structure of the task is cross-culturally stable. For the epoch battery, where we measure verbal, graphic, divergent, integrative, and so forth, we find the same structure in all of these different subpopulations. We compared it to the Wallach and Kogan test, in which actually the test showed different psychometric structures depending on the cultural group. So This is of interest because ideally a psychometric measure of creative potential, let's say, would be stable across cultures unless the very nature of creative potential differs from culture to culture, which is another option. Anyway, this is part of the cross-cultural question of who are creative people. Now I'm going to start to move on to some other examples here. Whoops. In terms of creative process, one study we did, we looked at art students who made sculptures. Ooh, sorry. And for some reason, it's moving ahead without me. In this kind of study, we well, I'll tell you about the creative process, although it moved on to the next C. We looked at how students evolve from activity to activity as they do a task. And we tried to follow what they do. Let's try to go back here. So in this slide that we have here, you see that they were, in fact, we decomposed what they were doing as an activity, and we broke it into steps, sub-activities, and we traced what students did when they moved from one to the next step every time they worked on their sculpture. We call this process tracing method, and we see what is the typical chain of events. At the end, we had found out that some of our art students were more creative at the end, and some were less. And we were able to split them into the more and less creative and compare the chain of events for each subgroup. And that led us to be able to see that there are certain chains in the process of creating that are more typical of those who finally end up to be creative, and other chains that are more typical of those who end up to be not too creative. So I'll just give you an example of that kind of work. We had, for example, art students, as they do sculpture, occasionally they take a break. When they come back from the break, which is an activity for us, they do another activity about their sculpture. Those who end up to be very creative in the end, when they come back, they tend to start free associating to the work they were doing already with new ideas. Others come back and they start out by evaluating what they've done so far before they start working again. Those who have a chain event from coming back from a break and starting to evaluate versus those who come back from the break and start to free associate to their work. The free association chain is probabilistically linked to being quite creative in the end with your sculpture. And those who come back and start to evaluate, they end up to be probabilistically in the group that's not too creative in the end. Here we have a third C, illustrates some kind of work on collaboration. And in this work, we had a chance to look at transportation system designers who consult with people who use a transportation system and run groups of idea research where designers ask transport users what they think of the system. And we had transcripts of these meetings, and we analyzed what happened in the meeting that was an important event for the designers in their thinking in terms of creativity to design new services of transportation in the Parisian area. We analyzed these interviews, these transcripts, and it ended up that we were able to detect what we call critical incidents using the Flanagan method. And we were able to detect, for example, that there are some incidents that are obviously positive, some things happen that are negative, and the things that happen that are negative are generally when they ask users of transport to give their own ideas. This usually ends up to be what the designers consider to go down a wrong alley. And the incidents that are positive is usually when designers ask people to reflect on the quality of service, for example, or different things that happened as they were transport users. So there was a kind of linkage between the way that experts, engineers, are looking for new ideas to improve the transportation system, the way they interact with users, this collaboration, we can analyze its nature and how it can be decoded. Now, a few words about creative context, the fourth C. Here I'd like to talk about some work in virtual space. I think everybody's heard lately a lot about the metaverse, and we've been doing work on virtual workspaces for creativity since approximately 10 years. And so we initially had an island in Second Life. And obviously, if you know Second Life and other metaverse, it's kind of a social place where you can go and hang out. So here you see our initial island in which we built a garden, and you arrived in one of our rooms, which we called the Artist Beach House. And this room unites many features that in France, psychology students find good and stimulating as a creative environment for them to think. So you can imagine being put into this as an avatar. We also created an environment here called the storage room, which unites many features that the students find not so good for creativity, kind of dark, ugly, with junk in there. And you can imagine being put into this one. And finally, we created a virtual meeting room, which was a normal meeting room. And we have our real meeting room in Paris area where we can put people in their regular body and have them do the same task as a base condition. One of the results we found was that when you put people in the beach house in an unusual uses task, they produce significantly more ideas and more original ideas than when you put them in a virtual meeting room or in the prison room, which do not differ from each other. And so this just supports that the environment can impact how much people are creative, including virtual environments. In further studies, we put people in the meeting room, in the regular mode, or in avatar mode, and we had them generate ideas, again, in a different task, brainstorming. Here we found in this particular study that being in virtual mode boosted idea generation and originality of ideas compared to being in the regular meeting room in your regular body. Probably because people felt more anonymous in their avatar, and it was also a little bit different from their normal life. It was a little bit like a gameplay situation. So this probably helped them to let go and give more ideas. Of the ideas given, a certain category of ideas was the most useful for being creative. It was the sort of science fiction type idea. And those in the virtual environment particularly were boosted to give science fiction type ideas, probably because it's compatible with the game virtual world. One other result which connects context with the creative individual was that we found that in particular, who benefits from the virtual environment to give science fiction ideas are those who are high on risk-taking in their profile relating to the creative profile method we used and discussed earlier in this presentation. And so you see that there's a connection. Not everyone benefits from a virtual environment to the same extent. There's a kind of an interaction between your profile as a person and the environment and what it offers to lead you to give these science fiction type ideas, which tend to be quite good. Also, depending on the avatar we give you, it can boost you. If we put you in an avatar that looks kind of like a scientific, like an Einsteinian type, people tend to give more ideas than if we put you in a so-called regular student avatar. Okay, now the fifth C refers to the creations, the productions that people do. Here's an example of a study that concerns creative productions. In this particular study, we showed advertisements, and they differed on their originality and how much they were considered appropriate and useful to convey the product. So the advertisement on the left shows the car. It's very appropriate to sell a car. It was not very original, but it was very clear about what it conveyed. The advertisement on the right was quite original, but it wasn't so clear what it conveyed, so it was kind of low on appropriateness. In this study, we measured the creativity of the judges using an unusual uses task, and we had their judgments of these various ads. And here is the result I'd like to highlight, was that, in fact, the best judges, a judge is good when they discriminate very well the different ads we showed and don't give the same score to each ad. The most discriminant judges are those who were themselves doing well on the divergent thinking task. So those who were quite able to generate many ideas of unusual uses turned out to be very discriminant, good judges for the high-end originality publicities we showed. And those who were low themselves on divergent thinking tended to not be such good judges. This is, again, an interaction between the creative person and the creative product and how people appreciate various differences in creative products. Two more C's before we have some questions. So here, I'd like to mention a study on consumption of goods, because under the C of creative consumption, the consumer can contribute to the development of a product through their consumption act. And we took this, at one moment, this new technology called a Pico projector, which connects to your phone and is like a PowerPoint projector, but mini. And we asked lead users who like to use new technology to try this new Pico projector, which had come out on the market just at that moment, and to generate ways they would use it that would be more or less original uses. It turns out that when these users were placed in the laboratory, sitting around generating, compared to being at home with the Pico projector, they were more productive of ideas, more original ideas, when they were at home than when they came to the lab. Also, when they worked alone to get ideas compared to working in groups, they were more productive and more original in their ideas when they worked alone. And we compared fake groups with real groups to control for the size of the group. And this just supported that being alone was more useful as a creative consumer than being with others who were sharing how to perhaps use this new product. So this study is just an example of the creative consumption topic, in which consumers can contribute their ideas to the meaning and growth and value of products as they use them. And now the last C, just quickly, is curricula. Can we develop creativity? Well, here's a result that was related to the OECD study. This particular one comes from Thailand, in which schools, either experimental schools where teachers try to promote creativity, or control schools where teachers just do the normal teaching. In fact, we have pre-test in blue, post-test in orange. What you see is that in divergent exploratory thinking, the DE part of the graph, the control group, pre-test to post-test, goes up a teeny bit, whereas the experimental group, where teachers try to promote creativity, goes up quite a bit, significantly. For the convergent integrative type of creative synthesis ability, the controls go up from pre to post, and so do the experimental groups, and that growth is not different between the control classes and experimental classes. And this was a study with many control classes and many experimental classes run across Thailand. In addition to this general trend that divergent thinking was more susceptible to teaching than convergent integrative creative synthesis type activities, it's interesting to note that different teachers had more or less an effect on their students. So teachers, we call them here teacher A, B, C, D, E, F, G, for example. And what you can see is that some teachers show quite a strong boost pre-test to post-test for their classrooms, and other teachers show almost no boost from pre to post. And these are all experimental teachers who all tried to promote creativity. So there's a lot of variability in the school environment, which is partly due to who is the teacher. So it's just an example of a study on developing creativity, the C of curricula. Okay. And so I come here to my last slide, which is just a summary of the main ideas. I was presenting to you a conception of creativity in which the topic of creativity can be conceived under 7 C's, each word starting with a C. And there were some examples of research, which I hope you can connect to and find some interest in insights. And I'd like to mention that a lot of studies can be considered interface studies, where, for example, we study the creative process under different environmental conditions. We study the creative process for people who have different patterns of cognitive or personality variables. Or we can study, for example, training studies for people who have differential ways of doing the creative process in a task, different strategies that they use, and does a given training affect these people in the same way? So these are examples of crossing 2 C's or more in research. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to stop the sharing. Let's see. So I hope you're still there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't see anybody, so it's a little bit
Thank
tricky.
you so much.
Right. So let's see. Yeah. Oh, here you are back. Okay.
Thank you, Todd, for this fascinating talk. We have a few minutes for questions, and just to give some time for people to write their questions, I wanted to ask a quick one. So you explained that the 7 C's are based on different conceptions of creativity. I was wondering whether there are some evidence, or if you have some insight on whether they align on different domains of studies or in the literature. For example, if we are running a bibliometric study with keyword creativity, would it form these 7 C's, or do you expect differences, or are you aware of some studies that did that?
Well, if you look at the literature and creativity, when I was thinking about the 7 C's, I found 7 piles of papers coming from the JCB, Journal of Creative Behavior corpus. Okay. And so that was my personal reading of the literature. And then each of the C's, well, I found a word, each of the piles, I found a word that starts with a C. However, you should know that in some of those piles, there's a lot more papers, a lot more articles and research than in other piles. So, for example, if you take consumer consumption and creativity, there's relatively little compared to creative process. If you take, for example, creative productions, the products, the criteria to judge them, and so forth, there are many studies. What are the criteria to judge products as creative in general? But very few who look at individual differences of judges, the example I showed in a study. So perhaps by looking in terms of research, where have people been working on a certain C and crossing a certain C, like creative process, with another C, you might get some ideas for research studies of interest. Also, I want to say, I know that this group here today is very interested in the neuroscience of creativity. As you know, I'm not doing specifically any neuroscience of creativity work. And so I hope that my general behavioral angle on creativity can interface with all the things that you're doing in terms of more specific neuroscience studies.
Yeah, I guess neuroscience can address different C's.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of very positive comments and a few questions that I will read. If people want to comment screen, please let us know in the chat. But for now, I will just read them. So the first one, apart from feelings of anonymity, what else do you think may drive higher creativity in virtual environments versus real world?
Okay. I think, first of all, when you go in a virtual environment, you're disconnected from your normal world, obviously. It's a little bit of a game-like environment. Most people see it that way. And so already they feel a little more playful. They feel a little detached from their regular world. So they're a little more open to say some new things, let's say. They feel a little liberated just by the game-like nature of being virtualized. And when you see your avatar, it's you, but it's not quite you. And usually it doesn't quite look like you. So you say, well, if my little avatar says something stupid, it's not exactly me. And so there's a bit of a liberating tendency we've observed. And we can enhance this. We've been studying it in detail. And obviously there's more and more details and more studies coming out. And so there are now a growing field of virtualized creativity studies and how to enhance creativity in that setting.
Yeah. Another question. When you explore all this literature, did you notice patterns regarding what areas were least represented? It's a question.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, least represented really is obviously consumption and creativity. That is very underrepresented topic. However, also collaboration is relatively underrepresented. You can take collaboration in two ways. You can take it as group creativity and how do people collaborate in a group. Not just that they're in a group and the group is more or less performant, but what's happening in that group interactive scene. Very little is known, in fact. And also there's a lot about collaboration of creativity where you're an individual, but you have interactions with others who are important to you as you create. So if you're a writer, you interact with your editor, let's say. Or if you're a scientist, you're working on your topic, your study, but you interact now and then with colleagues, or you interact with the journal where you submit. And this is, in a way, a collaborative act. So little is known about all that. Of course, there's been studies, in particular in improv groups or jazz groups. this kind of thing. It's kind of been a niche topic, whereas creative collaboration and consumption of creative goods actually are major topics that are worth more attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think the time is done, is finished. Thank you again, Todd, and thank you everyone to be here. Please join the next session. I put the link in the chat, and see you in a second.
Okay, thank you.